Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillah wassalatu wassalamu ala Rasulillah. In the name of Allah, the compassionate, the most merciful, all praises due to Allah. And may His peace and blessings be upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi wa sallam. We begin by greeting you all. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. May the peace and the blessings of Allah be upon you wherever you are, whenever time it is where you are. Delighted that you're joining us here this evening, inshallah, on Let's Talk About It on Thursdays, where we try to bring relevant topics. Nothing is taboo here. And we also like to bring talented people who are able to contribute and share with our community anything that is of importance that will help us grow. And tonight is one of these examples where I have a good friend of mine, even though I have not seen you in a while, but a really good friend of mine with a very impressive resume, with a very important topic that we will be addressing. It is my absolute honor and delight to present and welcome to the show Mohamed Elibiary. Mohamed, salaam alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, Sheikh.
It is so good to see you, man.
Pleasure is all mine, and it has been way too long.
Yes, I have not seen you in such a long time. And we have a really important topic tonight. We will be talking about Islamophobia. And I think, Mohammed, you are so well positioned to speak about this topic. Like you said, a really, really impressive bio here, really, really impressive resume. We're talking about somebody who was really, really influential post September 11th, talking about the American Muslim community, worked across the homeland security enterprise, multiple state and federal law enforcement and intelligence community agencies. Mohammed publicly served in homeland security policy advisory capacities, beginning at his local city level, then at the state of Texas level, followed by at the federal United States government level, and currently at the international level. MashaAllah, tabarakallah. Talking about graduating from one level to the next. In 2009, Mohammed was appointed by the Obama administration to serve on the Department of Homeland Security Countering Violent Extremism, CVE, something that we will be talking about, working group, and testified before the United States Congress on addressing homegrown violent extremism. October 2010, Mohammed was appointed to the Homeland Security Advisory Council by Secretary of Homeland Security Janet Napolitano, serving 2 terms until September 2014. Man, you've been busy, man, and we are only up to what, 2014? What have you been doing since then?
I'm just taking care of my family and feeling a lot older.
MashaAllah. This is really impressive. We're talking about you being part of the Homeland Security throughout the Obama administration. And I believe prior to that, you were also part of the Bush administration as well, at the federal and the state level. How's it going for you during the time of Trump?
For me personally, I haven't had any problems. But thankfully, basically, President Trump, within a month or so of taking office, got himself embroiled into making more enemies than he could possibly handle. And that gave an opportunity for more sane policy advisors to kind of push out some of the insane policy advisors that came in with President Trump, like Steve Bannon, Sebastian Gorka, and the list goes on. So, alhamdulillah, I would say that if we're looking back on his 4 years in office, there hasn't been a systemic or a strategic long-term negative impact on the organized American Muslim community. There has been more in the cultural war stuff. So the Muslim ban experience, I would classify in that. The number of people that it affects as compared to the whole Muslim community or the whole Muslim world is small, but that's what you do with symbolic gestures. And I think the Muslim ban was certainly a symbolic gesture towards the anti-Muslim segment of President Trump's electoral coalition, so to speak.
And interestingly, you say that there is the cultural component of the Islamophobes, and then there is the systemic design that's at the government level.
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay. Tell me the difference, and which one would you say is of the lesser impact? I know you're saying that looking at the numbers, the number of people impacted by the Muslim ban is just being symbolic and very minute and small. But which one do you think ought to grab our attention?
So, for example, one of the more strategic organizations that dabbles in Islamophobia a little bit is Daniel Pipes's Middle East Forum, for example. One of the strategic things they do is they grant fund a lot of startup or small shops of allies, political allies for their agenda, to attack the American Muslim community so that they don't, it keeps the American Muslim community from being able to arrive on the national scene with its national organizations providing like a coordinated, strong political lobby, so to speak. And one of the efforts that they sponsored was sent to the White House in the very early days of the Trump administration. And as I went through that document, because it was shared with me, it's like dozens and dozens of pages of strategic policies that they want to see the new Trump administration take in order to undermine the civil rights advocacy groups, for example, that are well known in our community, or the national Muslim organizations in general. And alhamdulillah, you had competing interests in the administration, and none of this strategic let's push or push back the American Muslim community's organizing and lobbying effectiveness back 10 years ever got done. So we're looking at a Trump administration ending here in the next possibly 2 months, inshallah. And he hasn't really gotten anything that you can say strategically sets the American Muslim community back a decade or any serious length of time. So that's an example of those people. The cultural ones are the ones we see in the media a lot. So, you know, the ones that know how to play in the right-wing press, they get a lot of attention. The Bridget Gabriel's Act for America people, the Robert Spencer's attacks on Islam, those kind of people, they have no effectiveness whatsoever in the policy sphere. So you have, and when the Trump administration and the White House met with them, the people that they had meet with them, I had interacted with like in the Bush years and seen them around Washington, D.C., and I know exactly where they were in the hierarchy of this White House. So they took, you know, they have access. A lot of crazy people that would have never been allowed within a mile of a normal Republican White House got invited to different events in this administration. So culturally, they feel that they've been mainstreamed. But when you look at what policies they actually got enacted that will outlast the Trump administration, they haven't really gotten anything.
And I think that's the good news.
That's the very good news. You can also see that when you check out the Islamophobes online, the traditional Islamophobes online communication, you can see in the past 4 years how much they've shifted over in what they're talking about. Like during the Obama administration, it was Islam, Muslims, Muslim Brotherhood, Islamists, jihad, Sharia. You know, all the buzzwords were always being said. Now you see them talking about more mainstream issues because they're trying to look like team players on the right. But that dilutes their niche messaging. If you're not going to get the policies that they advocate for passed in a Trump administration, then forget about when the Democrats come back into the office, right? So.
But Mohammed, and just reminding our viewers out there, if you have a question for Mohammed, please do go to the chat box on YouTube and ask your questions there as I'm looking into the questions coming in. And my question to you is the feeling within the community is that the Trump years have not been very kind to the Muslim community. And what I'm hearing you say is that, look, symbolically, the Muslim ban was there, but administratively, systematically, nothing really bad has happened to the community. But the sentiment out there, the amount of rage that you would think is out there against the Muslim community has definitely increased during the Trump era. And I think that unfortunately also being a jerk was a bit normalized during this time. Things that people would not say outright are now, normal part of speech. And as much as I want to celebrate the good news, we cannot really ignore what it has done to the community out here.
So my father, Allah yarhamu, was an officer in the Egyptian military, and when he came out of the 73 war, he spent 6 years in combat. But when he came out of the 73 war, he told me after I grew up, of course, he said, look, don't fight wars on two fronts simultaneously. So we had a war on the Islamophobic war, basically on the culture side and on the policy side. Which one does the most damage? The policy side. That's a logical decision. But the culture side has the most emotional impact on the average American Muslim. So we have, alhamdulillah, by the grace of Allah, passed this period, or are about to pass this period, and we will be able to breathe again from the fears of the policy side. On the culture side, now we can shift more of our attention during the next Democratic administration to say, what can we do differently this time to make sure that when the Democrats lose the White House the next time, because they're not going to be in office forever, what can we do differently to make that time better for the American Muslim community culturally? When President Obama was elected in 2008, I was on TV during that campaign supporting John McCain. So I was a Muslim that, as a Republican, supported McCain, and I knew he was an honorable man way before you saw him defending candidate Obama's right to run for office and all the other smears that he was facing. But when so I knew the Muslims who were on the other side supporting Obama's campaign in DC. And my conversations with a lot of my friends, and these are my generation's folks, is they thought with the election of Obama, the world's changed. Khalas. It's over. We never have to worry about the right wing and Islamophobia, and it was all Bush's fault, and he took us in Iraq, and the Islamophobia was a backlash to 9/11 and Iraq. And the right wing will have no more say. The country demographically changed. So now we will never have that older generation have their say again. Personally, I thought that was a little too optimistic. But we didn't do the work as a community to make sure that when the next Republican primary comes in 2016, that it would be harder culturally to market Islamophobic comments.
I'm sorry, before you go on, can you shed some light on where did that optimism come from? Was it just the fact that Obama was a minority, was a Black African American? Is this why people felt the way that they did?
Especially in my generation, that went to work in different government agencies and stuff. They felt by one minority breaking through, the glass ceiling is done. But as we've seen, human evolution doesn't happen this way. Look at the democratization movement in Muslim majority countries. And you can always see there's progress and then there's counter-revolutionary activity for a while. Nothing goes in a straight line. And that's something that my generation probably felt, especially millennials that came right after me. They were just too optimistic.
Got it. Okay, so carry on. So you're saying that they were too optimistic and they did not pay attention to what would happen in the next primaries. And I think that's when I...
See, it's very hard during a time of success to think about prevention work. And this is what I'm talking about. We need to, as a Muslim community, think about prevention for the campaign. After this election, there will be Republicans running for president in 2024. At least one of those candidates will represent a lot of the populist nationalism of Trump. Now, culturally, as American Muslims, we get lumped in with a larger group that's being targeted by the Trump movement. And that group is immigrants. There is a resentment amongst nativist people in this country to the large growth of first-generation Americans. And 1 out of 6 Americans, roughly, is born overseas, American citizens. So that's towards the high end in American history. So every time you get towards the high end of something, you're going to get some social tension and pushback. And that's where we are today in our country. Now, 2024, I am less concerned about Trump today. In fact, when I think of his name, I honestly think of comic relief. Because the man has now shown the American people what he's really capable of. And it is not a competent image. So therefore, I fear less for the American Muslim community, because any policy he's going to try to put targeting our community is going to receive broad pushback in society, because by the general population that just doesn't trust him or like him. Views him.
Would you not say then that's also too optimistic, maybe?
No, I saw how hard it was to change US policy. So it takes a long time and a lot of consensus building to pass new legislation. And the big strategic thing that Trump wants to do on the immigration issue is not the border wall. It is actually passing new legislation to bring us back to like what happened in the 1920s, where we have a pause in legal immigration, as opposed to 1 million new citizens every single year, or 1 million new immigrants, legal immigrants every single year that end up becoming citizens, and each one bringing on average 2 to 3 relatives over their lifetimes. So now he wants to pause that pipeline. The refugee pipeline is small. He paused that. The next president can expand it because the executive branch, the presidency, has the power to expand it and shrink it as much as they want. This is why Biden is promising to increase it, I think, up to 7-fold or something from before. Now, but getting legislation passed to change legal immigration is what's going to strategically impact the American Muslim community, because we're about almost 10% or so of the legal immigration in this country. So if you're having that pipeline of Muslims coming in every single year legally, becoming citizens, settling down, that's why you have this momentum behind the masajid growth that we've had in the country for the past several decades. That's, and the community flowering in all the major metropolitan areas. And that's what gave birth to the next generation that I was like part of. When my father might have immigrated into the suburbs, and then I was raised in the suburbs. And then you look around in the suburbs today, and my kids are going to schools that are majority minority. When I went to some elementary schools where there was literally 2 minorities in the whole school, me and an African-American boy in one and an African-American girl in the other one. And that was your early 80s in North Texas.
Interesting. And Mohamed, do me a favor. I am really enjoying this conversation, and I think part of what you're saying is new. I don't think it's new to you, but the idea of during the time of success, people don't usually want to speak about prevention. They want to celebrate what is going on, and sometimes maybe these voices are really unheard simply because you're the downer. You are you're the party pooper. You're like, why can't you just celebrate what is going on? Type of an approach. How do you make these voices heard?
So I am a firm believer in that if you want to change the trajectory of a community, you work with its leadership.
Okay.
You don't mass market to the population generally. Because the grassroots in any community is going to be less focused on change and less analytical. They're going to be emotionally impacted more than the leadership is. The story I shared to you about being the prevention work, I'll give you an example. You remember Texas Dawah Convention in Houston? It used to happen every year. In 2008, after the election of Obama, during that same campaign I was talking about, there was 2 of us, I believe myself and Shahid Amanullah, who supported the Obama Biden ticket, of course. And we were on a panel.
I remember.
And I said to that 2,000 plus people in the audience at an Islamic conference, we as a community over the next 5 years should strategically set a goal to mend fences with George W. Bush. We should invite him to a masjid domestically in our community, as opposed to the masjid that he went to in DC that's owned by the Saudi embassy or what have you, or for ambassadors. And instead, integrate him into the community, because we will need him in the future. We need to separate our frustrations over the war in Iraq from this new era where Obama's in office. And I was told by some prominent community leaders at the time that I was being naive. And the community would never accept George W. Bush ever stepping foot in the masjid. There will always be protests and so on. Fast forward when Obama gets elected, and then it triggers an opening for Trump to rise up with the birther movement and then to eventually run. who did we see coming out to oppose Trump? Amongst those key Republican figures was President George W. Bush, coming out and putting out pro-immigration messages. Similarly, we saw John McCain. In 2008, when I supported John McCain, there were grassroots in the community folks who posted on blogs attacking me for supporting the warmonger McCain. But when fast forward, when this stuff happened, that same individual who wrote the blog post apologized to me in DC when he saw how in our system of politics in America, you need to have allies in both camps. Don't leave the territory on
Mohamed, just give me 1 second.
Okay.
I think I am about to hear you in just a second. Okay. So I lost you when you were talking about John McCain and Bush came pro-immigration messages, and that's when I lost you. Sorry about that.
We have in our system here in America people on the left and people on the right, or Democrats or Republicans. We, as American Muslims, in order to win the culture, you're having technical difficulties on your end with the earpiece?
Now I can hear you. Now I can hear you.
Alhamdulillah.
We're talking about the left and the right.
Yeah, I was saying that we should never leave one side of the political spectrum totally free for the Islamophobes to culturally rile up people against our community. We need allies on the right. We need a lot more strategic engagement of folks on the right. And the Muslim community for the past 15 years has by and large not spent enough resources and time bridge building on the right. It hasn't been easy. It's always easier to build when people are welcoming. But there are a lot of Muslims that I don't want to take anything away from them who are trying to do good on the right, but there's too few. So I would encourage the next generation to invest a little bit more on the right, because we have plenty of allies on the left. Now I can't hear you, ya Sheikh. Are you muted?
Apologies, you can hear me now.
Yes.
All right, so it seems like the way that we think, at least from the people that I've been talking to, we are at this fork, and you must make a choice. Align with the left, and that's going to have its consequences. Align with the right, and that's going to have its consequences. Mainly, there is a lot of bigotry, racism on the right, and then of course the left is way too extreme, in their un-Islamic agenda. Let's put it that way. So the people are looking into this, and most people, I don't think that they are aligning with the left for that, but there is really that sense of this feels safer. And what I hear you say is, look, you may be working with the left or right now, but you also not need to lose the right. Is this what you're proposing? I just want to be clear about.
I'm saying let's do the same thing Catholics did in this country.
Okay.
100 years ago, you don't have to go 100 years ago, but like you might remember in the 90s and early 2000s, CARE was working on removing headdress restrictions on teachers in like the Northwest Washington state and such.
Right.
Those rules had been there for 100 years. They weren't set up for Muslims. Why were they there? It's because there was at the time in America very strong anti-Catholic feelings from the Protestant majority. And what happened with Catholics is, they were isolated or attacked by one party for a while, and they made a lot of inroads in another party. So for example, in the Northwest, they made a lot of inroads in the Democratic Party. That's why you have things like the, what's his name, the Smith the guy who first ran for president as a Catholic, there's an annual dinner in New York City that's very famous, banquet done for him or in honor of his work. But you fast forward to today and you see that what has happened on the right is evangelicals and Protestants and conservatives in general have shut down a lot of hate, anti-Catholic hate on the right, because they need Catholics for several things. They need Catholics to vote for them, or otherwise they lose the culture war to the left. If you look on the Supreme Court, all the Republicans that were appointed to the Supreme Court, nominated and appointed in the last, say, 15 years or so, they're all Catholic. Not one is evangelical. You can also see that the pro-life movement is very dependent on the Catholic support. But go back just 20, 30, 40 years, and you'll find that just like talk show hosts, remember after 9/11, we would turn on the radio in our cars and we'd hear constant bashing of Islamophobic talk from the typical talk radio hosts? Well, there was a meeting in DC where a prominent national Republican invited a group of us American Muslims to meet with, amongst others, national Catholic leaders. And we asked them, how did you guys get talk radio to stop spewing hate about your community? And they told us for a long time, there used to be, they would be called cultists. They would be attacked every single day. But then what they did is they went out and bought stations. So pretty quickly, they reached 10% of the stations, the radio stations across the country were owned by Catholics. If you were a rising talk show host and you wanted to be syndicated nationally, you couldn't afford to be anti-Catholic, because 10% of the channels wouldn't carry you, and those 10% bargained with the other nationally syndicated hosts, so you got boxed out. Now, the economics of the country have changed. So now it doesn't mean that there aren't anti-Catholic haters. Here in Dallas, the mega pastor leader of First Baptist Dallas is very famous for his evil talk about not just Catholics, but the Pope, and it's Satan's religion and this and that.
Is that John Hagee?
No, that's in San Antonio.
Dallas.
Yeah. In Dallas, that guy has opened up for Trump many a times and is, seen in pictures praying over his head and all this stuff. So at the end of the day, he's not able to grow past where he's at in that one mega church because of Catholic work that was done amongst conservatives to basically isolate him on this issue. Trump is the first Republican president that I've seen embrace him so much. But I think this prevention work, just like Catholics did, we can do as American Muslims on a larger scale than the ad hoc work that I've seen around the country.
Mohamed, and I don't know how comfortable you feel about this, but I know that speaking about this type of work, CVE has been a big, huge issue. And reading your bio, you were one of the people that actually participated in that. And just for the sake of getting people aware of what it is, please tell us what CVE is, what was it intended for, and why has it become such a divisive issue within the community?
So my activism around the issue of counterterrorism and how it impacts our community goes back to literally 2 weeks after 9/11. That's when my community in Dallas had the Holy Land Foundation closed down by an executive order from President Bush. And we had a lot of terrorism investigations and a lot of community members who got hurt, families broken up, deported, and the sad story that you've heard in other cities around the country. And what I learned from that experience was there is a limit to using the law to challenge an executive branch when it comes to domestic national security related topics, like protecting the public from a terrorist attack. Sheikh, I lost your video, by the way. Should I continue, or is my voice still broadcasting?
Yes, please continue. He's here. He's just working on his camera.
Okay. So what I learned is there's a couple of different things that work. One is a couple of different terrorism related categories that impact the American Muslim community. One is material support investigations of organizations, so like our charities, and whether they should be closed down or versus other models where they might have, say, the management resign or something, but the organization continues. And then the other category is homegrown terrorism cases in America. The way the law was written at the time. Are you back, Yasir? So the way the law was written after 9/11 was treating terrorism suspects as kind of like one big pot. They're all, bin Laden types or 9/11 hijacker types. When the reality is a lot of the homegrown violent extremism cases that we had from our community are much more mild, and some of them are actually more delinquency issues than have evolved to the point of actually committing a terrorist crime. So the only tool that was available to law enforcement. Okay, welcome back.
I was hearing you. I heard everything that you said. Yeah, I was hearing you fine and clear.
So the only tool that was available to federal law enforcement during the Bush administration was what we vernacularly call the sting operation. So when you have like an undercover agent would pretend to be an Al-Qaeda guy, he's meeting with some 18-year-old Muslim kid, and he's talking to him, pretending to be Al-Qaeda, and then the kid basically says something stupid on Facebook. And then boom, you've got intent proven to provide material support to a designated terrorist organization, and you push them in the pipeline. And what I saw Congress was doing during that time was they were increasing and enhancing the material support punishment, statute punishment. So these kids were going to jail for longer, 15 years and longer. And what I saw was, I tried working with, remember my career, you can say I started off as an activist who became a policy analyst, then became a policy advisor. So at each level, I learned something differently. When I was at the advocacy level, I saw, whether it was CARE or the ACLU or others that I worked with, we were initially trying to reform the Patriot Act that got passed. And that experience taught me that we can't reform the Patriot Act. You can't get Congress to actually reverse national security legislation very easily. So we then had to create something to protect the American Muslim youth that end up coming under the spotlight of law enforcement. So we needed something between let them keep doing, saying whatever they want to say online, and flirting and watching jihadi videos all day, and nobody ever talks to them, like a local imam or their parents are clueless to what's happening. And on the other side of the spectrum is the FBI is the only organization told, go in with and treat this like you would treat drug cases, where you pretend you're undercover sting operation model. So we said, we lobbied to say, look, we need an off-ramp for these kids. And I
Sorry, who is we? Who is we?
Is some members from the community, but more counterterrorism officials who were in different agencies during the Bush administration that I was friends with. And I'll just leave that as that right now.
I'm sorry, what I meant is this was not necessarily a move that had received the blessings of the community.
No, the community was telling us this is a problem, solve it. And the solution, the only solution that the community was trying to solve it with is to tell the government, stop going after these kids, which the politicians and the law in the country was mandating that they have to go after these kids. So in 2004, Congress with 85% support in both the House and the Senate, both parties, passed an Intelligence Reform Act that mandated that the FBI has to do what's called the preemption mission. Preemption means the undercover sting operation approach that I was talking about earlier. So they have to preempt before a bomb is going to be put together, for example. So as the plot is coming together and a kid is flirting with wanting to support but doesn't know how to support yet, so he's mouthing off on Facebook or something, social media, they would need to get involved at that point. They can't just sit and not watch anything and wait for an actual attack to materialize in the country. The politicians moved the line of what the law says. The community was seeing the effect of that line move and saying this is unfair. But the community didn't have any tool other than to say, move the line back, which you couldn't do politically in this country. So what we were saying is, let's create an off-ramp for kids who haven't committed a crime yet. And let's basically mentor them away from these radicalized thoughts and these extremists. Let's put people who know how to counter these ideas with them. And I personally piloted several incidences where somebody from the community, usually a parent, would reach out to a sheikh, and the sheikh would reach out to me, and I would reach out to the FBI. And I would play the liaison role because I know what the law enforcement community needs to do. And in every case I've ever worked during that period, the kid didn't end up in jail. He didn't end up in a sting operation. So that's why I have the trust that I built up, the credibility with several mashayikh that you know. It's because I showed that I was prioritizing saving these kids like a big brother would. So I looked at myself and my role as a shepherd to protect them. This off-ramping model ended up.
Sorry, Mohamed. I'm sorry. Prioritizing them over what? What was the other option?
The alternative is to leave them to the law enforcement community and say, it's not my problem as a community leader because I'm not related to that kid. Now, some people, some community leaders and anti-CVE voices that are very prominent came and sat in my living room for hours where we would talk about these strategies. And they had some legitimate arguments to say in those very early years, it is not the responsibility of the Hispanic community, for example, to organize itself to go do, keep Latino kids from getting involved with transnational gangs like MS-13 and drug smuggling from Latin America.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it the American Muslim community's responsibility to do all this volunteer work in what became CVE to save these kids?
Mm-hmm.
And I said, it is not a fair dynamic that the Latino community has and the American Muslim community has. We're a much smaller number. And when the government moves against our community, it causes more damage to our community than it would do to the Latino community. And I would share with them the experience I saw in Dallas with the Holy Land Foundation. So, and then I would say, when the media covers the FBI goes and does a sting operation and arrests a young American Muslim kid and makes him look like he is a big, huge threat like 9/11, then we all in the community receive the backlash in society. So this is another reason that tells me go do the proactive work, even though we don't have to. It's unfair, but we can't take the consequences of sitting on our hands, like the Latino community, which is much larger, can afford to do. Another argument that they presented, some of Voices, they said, okay, what you're doing is not, there's no legal framework for it. There's nothing passed by Congress that was in the law during the Bush years that said if a community member like an Imam Yasir contacts his local FBI office and says, we have this kid in our community, he's been watching a lot of bad stuff on YouTube, his parents reached out to me, I want you to just let me talk with him, I think I can straighten him out, just like African-American pastors in decades past straightened out young kids who would gravitate to joining gangs. And they would say, well, why? There's no protection for Sheikh Yasir or Mohamed Elibiary to work with the FBI. Maybe they will entrap us, for example, in a legal case. And I would say that is true. It's a possibility. And that's why I never came out publicly and said, just go and do, everybody go do what I do. I always worked with specific community leaders that were kind of trained to understand what is the legal framework out there and who they can trust in the federal law enforcement community from the FBI or whatever, and how do you protect yourself as a community leader in these liaison roles. Again, when the Obama administration came in, these ideas were already around the National Counterterrorism Center. They were around in some DHS circles. And they said in the Bush and Obama administration, let's package this framework and call it countering violent extremism. Because there was a lot of lobbying from civil libertarians that the term terrorism scares the American public. So find something a little bit milder. So they came up with CVE. Now, as a framework, there is nothing as a community leader for me to say CVE is bad. But you can have a conceptual framework, and then you can have a program. Now, when a program gets operationalized, you have to judge that specific CVE program on its own merit. How is it operating in the real world? The way I was doing this CVE stuff, piloting the stuff in, say, CVE 1.0, was as a volunteer. I never received even reimbursements from the FBI, even though they offered Joint Terrorism Task Forces. Supervisors have offered to reimburse me for the expenses of doing this kind of work. Sometimes it involved travel and other things. But working with other mashayikh that you know, I was very careful from the very beginning to say, never show that you're taking money from the government if you're working in the community, because the community trust is vital to doing the work that I do. If I lose that, then I'm not of a benefit to anybody at either end, the government or the community. Some people, when CVE went to CVE 2.0, so to speak, and they wanted to operationalize programs around the country, some community leaders said, let's apply for money and let's build up capacity to be able in our community to do something similar to protect these youth. So their intention was good. I don't doubt that. But there wasn't ijma' or consensus in that community for that next step. And a perfect community where I saw this schism was Southern California. So Sheikh Mohamed Faqih asked me to come out one time and sit with the community leaders for many hours from the different organizations and have off the record conversations about everything around this topic. In my community, early on, I tried to build ijma' when I took these steps. And that's why I was always involving the mashaykh early on, a prominent mashaykh in Texas here. But that Southern California is a perfect example of where there was no ijma'. There was a schism, and it was clear. And it's unfortunate. Now, as an activist, I understand people who stand up and say all CVE is bad. It's easy, but it's also lazy intellectually to argue that. Because what you're saying is that the alternative is going to be everybody going into prison who comes under these cases. I want to see the least number of people end up in prison, in the criminal justice system, and ruin their lives for the next 20, 30, 40 years. So therefore, I need an off-ramp. We have to have CVE. Otherwise, you also will see the American Muslim community be overly policed, just like the experience of African Americans. You know, a lot of the fear that you have in the law enforcement community from terrorism 10 years ago, I was seeing as a repeat of a lot of what happened in the 60s and 70s in the African American community with the rise of gangs and the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army after that, and all kinds of like Black nationalist stuff. That kind of aggressive voice was triggering back then a lot of very bad policing that abused and hurt the African American community. And we don't want to go through that same experience again. You know, almost at least a quarter of the American Muslim community is African American. So why put our community back through that instead of learning from their experience? I think the challenge today, CVE is not going away. Even Trump couldn't remove CVE, because what started off as a framework that we helped craft has now passed in legislation in the United States for DHS to do more of this prevention work. And then the United Nations has passed resolutions encouraging other governments around the world to head in that same direction. One of the, I think remember when we were talking earlier about how Trump, alhamdulillah, is not a very strategic policy type of president? One of the things he could have done when he first took office is he could have said, I am not going to try to get rid of the CVE grant program, which is like a very ceremonial type of move, but for his right-wing base. But he could have said, I think we should add the issues of social cohesion to the issues of counter-extremism, which, if you remember when Tony Blair came into office in England, he revamped the PREVENT program, which is their version of CVE. So you basically have one prime minister before him was saying, no, let's just focus on the violence part, the extremism. He comes in and he says, I will marginalize the mainstream British Muslim organizations like MCB and others, Muslim Council of Britain, in order to not have to deal with them over their objections for the war in Iraq or whatever else. And then you have this shift that went a couple of times in the UK, where they were combining counter-extremism with social cohesion. Social cohesion allows you to go after conservative Muslims and say, you know, Salafism is a form of extremism, for example. So if you're socially conservative as a Muslim, then you're closer to the jihadis.
And I don't think you're giving Trump any ideas at this point. Hopefully, that's. But you're saying that it could have been that. But Mohamed, we're running out of time, and this is definitely a conversation that needs to be extended. But do me a favor, just going back to resources for people who want to know more about what is going on with Islamophobia. I know that CARE has published a study before, telling us who people are and where do they get their money from, who is funding them, what is it that they say. And I know it's been about 3-4 years, I think, since that study came out. And I believe you have resources for us that we want our viewers to see. If I want to learn more about what's going on, what are the resources you're suggesting?
So 3 of the resources that have traditionally been coming out over the past decade that have had the biggest impact was the Center for American Progress, which is a progressive think tank in Washington, D.C. It's pretty large. So the Center for American Progress, CAP in short. They put out the first report that you're mentioning about tracing the money and what foundations are supporting the Islamophobic organizations or Islamophobia organizations. CARE puts out an annual report on Islamophobia. They had an Islamophobia department that was set up also about a decade ago. I contributed to some of those reports over the years because just like I, off the record, also gave an interview to the CAP researcher for their initial report. Because I spent so much of my time the past 25 years on the right in the Republican Party, I know what the scene looks like a little bit more than somebody from outside. The third one I would say is probably Dr. Hatem out at UC Berkeley and the Islamophobia reports, the newsletters that he puts out. But today you actually, if you Google just Islamophobia, you're going to find that there are tons of universities that are now also have some form of research going on the topic. Just my advice, though, is to always remember that lesson we were taught in elementary school about cause and effect. A lot of the articles on Islamophobia are looking at the effect on our community and saying it's disproportionate, it's unfair, it's discriminatory effects. What is the cause? You can't say that the cause is always bigotry. A lot of times what I have found is the cause, especially in the law enforcement sphere, is because there's lack of alternative tools and poor training, and a lot of the same things that you hear now during the Black Lives Matter era. Poor training and poor supervision of agents. You need to solve those kind of problems by actually engaging more in those security agencies, not less. They don't get solved otherwise. They become endemic where they continue on for a long time. And we're always trying to leave it better for the next generation than the way we found it for ourselves. So I will leave you with those three sources as examples, but look through them, remembering cause and effect, and always
Nice.
look for policy solutions, because that's how this country works.
Nice. Mohammed, this has been a pleasure. And like I said, this is a conversation that absolutely needs to continue. The elections are coming up, and I know that you've been talking about how long you've been a Republican. I've been following your tweets, and you made it very clear that you are.
And never try.
Yes, and you said it. You said it. But please do promise me that you will come back after the elections. I'm not sure when we will find out who won the elections, but whenever we do, we would absolutely love to have you back.
Jazakallah khairan, ya Sheikh. And inshallah, next year, look forward to visiting you in person.
Next year, well, that's like in 2 months. You're right. You're right. All righty. Beautiful. And to all of our viewers, thank you very much for joining us this evening. And inshallah, as promised, Mohammed will join us after the elections. We'll be here next Thursday. Please do join us. Until then, we say so long and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.